The libertarian economist Walter Williams was born in 1936 in a poor but thriving section of Philadelphia that was later torn apart by crime and violence.
This is where we lived, the Richard Allen Project of North Philadelphia.
When Williams was a small child, his father deserted his family. He was raised by his mother, who was a high school dropout, and the family spent time on welfare.
I broke out of the North Philadelphia ghetto nearly 30 years ago, and so did most of my friends.
Drafted into the peacetime army, Williams eventually earned a Ph.D. from UCLA in the late 1960s, and he soon became a sought-after researcher and public intellectual. His best-known book, 1982's The State Against Blacks, argues that a major cause of black unemployment is government intervention in the labor market.
It is morally outrageous for government to be cutting off the ambitions of those trying to climb the middle rungs of the economic ladder.
You're saying that you can solve the problems in Bangladesh.
Williams' contrarian views have had wide exposure through documentaries, public appearances, and for the past 30 years, a syndicated weekly column that appears in about 140 newspapers. Throughout his career, Williams has used his personal experiences to illustrate his ideas.
I used to work in a store like this. Back in those days, just about any kid who looked for a job could find one. Today, in ghettos like I grew up in, 70% of black children who look for jobs cannot find them.
His new book, Up from the Projects, an autobiography, is a fascinating look at his childhood, his half-century-long marriage to his recently departed wife, his unusual career path, and the genesis of his views on race, economics, and politics. Reason TV spoke with Williams, an emeritus trustee of the Reason Foundation, at his office at Virginia's George Mason University. Walter, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
You were growing up in Philadelphia. You spent time on welfare. You were raised in a single-parent household. How does where you're from show up in where you are now?
Well, I'm not sure. As a youngster, I never even thought about being a college professor or a libertarian. I was always a radical, a troublemaker, a person who questioned the status quo. So my upbringing might have had very little to do with where I am now. And matter of fact, even though we grew up poor, we didn't consider ourselves poor. That is, matter of fact, during those days, to call somebody poor was an insult, or even to.
What did being called poor mean then?
Well, it meant that you didn't eat, or you missed meals, or you wore tattered clothes, and all those weren't the case with me. But at least in the neighborhoods where I grew up, in poor black neighborhoods today, there's kind of what I call spiritual poverty. That is poverty of the spirit. And back when I was a kid, my mother used to always say to us, she says, we have a beer pocketbook, but we have champagne taste. Meaning that we had high aspirations.
So where does the spiritual poverty, or where does the aspirational poverty come from?
Well, if you look at some of the characteristics, particularly of black people, but it applies to a large extent to everybody, back when I was coming up, that is, for a girl to have a baby out of wedlock, it was a disgrace. Today, women have babies out of wedlock, and they have baby showers. It's no longer a disgrace. And indeed, the illegitimacy rate among blacks is somewhere around 70%. And back in the 40s, it couldn't have been more than 13, 12%, something like that. Or the breakdown in the black family, only 35% of kids, black kids, live in two-parent families. And matter of fact, when we were coming up, my father deserted us when I was 3 and my sister was 2, and they ultimately got divorced in the late 40s. But among our friends, we were the only kids in the Richard Allen Housing Project that did not have a mother and father in the house, and today would be exactly the opposite. It would be rare to have a mother and father in the household today.
In 2008, you wrote that Obama's election, and I'm quoting here, might turn our attention away from the false notion that discrimination explains the problems of a large segment of the black community. Has that happened?
I don't think Obama's presidency hasn't meant very much for the black community. I don't see any big change. I don't see lower crime rates. I don't see greater high school graduation rates. But in general, I don't think that there's much progress that blacks can make through the political arena. And
now, what do you mean by that? Because this is, You know, I think most most observers, whether they're black or white or you know, European, whatever, would say that, you know, a lot of black progress has been because of Civil Rights Act, because of changes in de jure segregation.
If you ask the question, you look at our country and you ask the question, in what cities do blacks have the highest crime, suffer from the highest victimization rates from crime, the rottenest schools, the very, very poor living conditions? They are in the very cities where a black is the mayor, a black is chief of the police, a black is the superintendent of schools. Now, I'm not stating a causal relationship, but I'm saying that if political power meant so much, you would expect, let's in a city like Philadelphia, where a black is the mayor, a black is superintendent of school, black chief of police, you'd expect every living conditions to be wonderful. And on the other hand, if you look at the other end of another group of people, let's say Chinese and Japanese, they don't have any political power, even in the places such on the West Coast where they're the most numerous.
I'm not even sure the Chinese have much political power in China.
That's well, at least in the United States.
Right, yeah.
But however, according to statistics, Japanese or Chinese are on any measure of socioeconomic success, they're at the very top. And matter of fact, if you look in our history of our country, the Irish had the greatest political power, but they're the slowest rising of any of the white ethnic groups in our country. So I think it's false to assume that economic power depends on political power, and you can just go all around the world. My colleague Tom Sowell has done extensive work on, you know, the Armenians in the post-Ottoman Empire. They didn't have any political power; they were discriminated against, but highest income earning people.
Yeah, Jews as well throughout various subsets.
Yeah, the Chinese and Southeast Asia. Yeah.
If it's not political power that will help advance living standards and quality of life, how do you? I mean, it's economic power then, right?
You have to develop skills and training. And one of the reasons why people make low wages is, for the most part, they have low skills. But getting hold of the political system, or even eliminating every vestige of discrimination, is not very important for economic advancement. I mean, if you look at the question, at one time there were no blacks in the professional basketball. Today, blacks are 80% of professional basketball players, 60-some% of professional football players, and it wasn't any affirmative action, it wasn't any court suits, it wasn't getting rid of discrimination. What was it? It was that these guys can just do a 360 slam dunk in your face and you can't do anything about it. It was just high skills.
But it was an undoing of discrimination, right? I mean, when you think about football and basketball's color lines are less kind of celebrated than Jackie Robinson breaking into Major League Baseball, but there was a de facto law against letting blacks play.
Well, the best engines of it, even in terms of baseball, it wasn't any affirmative action. It wasn't any court suits. It was the fact that there was a huge pool of high skills in the Negro, what they call the Negro leagues, that just could not be ignored. And once the Dodgers cracked it, everybody else had to go along. They just could not ignore this huge pool of black talent.
Well, you would agree.
And it would be the same thing if this black talent were in physics, whereas in chemistry, you just could not ignore it.